This is the Ethanol Report, the industry podcast from the Renewable Fuels Association since 2008. I'm Cindy Zimmerman. Despite coming to the end of 2025 without getting that pony under the Christmas tree that is nationwide year-round E15, the ethanol industry ended up with a pretty darn good year after all is said and done, including hitting some major records. Wrapping up 2025 for the ethanol industry with me is Renewable Fuels Association President and CEO Geoff Cooper. And Geoff, let's start off first with E15. Once again, the number one priority for RFA to get nationwide. But while that failed once again, the consolation prize this year was a big one, and that was California. So tell us what happened in 2025 with E15 and where we are now going into 2026.
Well, I think it's been a decent year for E15, but it could have been much better, and that's the unfortunate part. It is disappointing, maybe unfortunate that we are talking about E15 again this year. It was the big story at this time last year. We came within a centimeter or two of getting year-round E15 legislation included in that continuing resolution bill last December. Unfortunately, got stripped out at the last moment. So we had yet another year of uncertainty and confusion in the marketplace around the status of E15. We did sell a record amount of E15 in 2025, but that volume was far below what it could have been had Congress passed that legislation last December. And so here we are again. We had to rely on EPA again to issue emergency waivers in 2025 to allow retailers to continue selling E15 through the summer months. And obviously, it's never a guarantee that we're going to get those emergency waivers. They always come at the last minute. And they did again in 2025. It was the very end of April, just a few days before the summer gasoline season started, when we got word from EPA that they would be again issuing those emergency waivers. And those are helpful to retailers that are already selling E15 because they can continue selling that product through the summer. But it's not helpful in bringing new retailers and new markets and new businesses into the E15 space. And so it was, another highly uncertain year for E15 at the federal level. And, retailers have shown us over and over and over again that they are not willing to make big investments in E15 without the long-term certainty that they can sell that product to their customers year round. So today, a year later, it remains the single most important thing Congress can do and the single most important thing the Trump administration can do to support biofuels and really support farmers is pass that year-round E15 legislation. And there is legislation pending in Congress today. It's got bipartisan support, and we're hopeful that Congress can get its act together very early in 2026 and get this legislation passed and put this issue behind us once and for all. So we're not talking about this again at this time next year. So I guess that's the bad news on E15. There was good news too, as you mentioned, great news for the industry. We got very good news in early September in California. The legislature there unanimously passed Assembly Bill 30, and that bill immediately made E15 a legal fuel in the state of California. And prior to that bill passing, California, as you know, was the very last state that had not yet approved E15. It also happens to be one of the largest, I think the second largest fuel consuming state in the country. So a very important market for E15, for ethanol in general. And so we worked all year. RFA worked all year long with friends and supporters in California, in the Assembly, in the governor's office, in the Senate to get this bill introduced and get it passed. As I mentioned, it passed unanimously on every vote. Governor Newsom signed it into law in October. So now we're just waiting on a couple of I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed by a few state agencies that have a role in implementing AB 30. And once that happens, retailers can start selling E15 in California. And we do expect to see that happen very early in 2026.
Well, and that sets us up once again for E15 to be the top priority for the ethanol industry in 2026. But we had a lot of other wins in 2025. What I did when I prepared for this end of the year interview, I went back and looked at the press releases that RFA sent out in 2025. And the first press release for the year was on ethanol exports and how exports in 2024 had already set a record after just 11 months. And I know we've seen tariffs and trade and exports have been big news all year long, and ethanol exports have been doing very well. So tell us what you expect for the export picture once it's all said and done for 2025.
Well, I'm pleased to say, Cindy, I think we'll be issuing a very similar press release very shortly because we are again expecting record exports in 2025. We don't have all the final numbers and data, and we won't for a few months. But we are expecting that last year's record will be broken in 2025. We're expecting somewhere around 2.1 or 2.2 billion gallons of ethanol exports, which is up from last year's record of around 1.9 billion gallons. So without a doubt, the boom in exports has been another big story for the industry in 2025. And frankly, it's the reason we're seeing incremental growth in the industry today. That's really the growth in exports is what is supporting growth in overall production and really helping to keep a floor under profitability and a floor under production and keep supply and demand in balance for our industry. Um, I think heading into 2025, so, this time a year ago, there was definitely some concern in the industry that ethanol could get caught up in the brewing trade wars that we knew were coming. There was fear that ethanol could be collateral damage in some of those retaliatory actions and reciprocal tariffs and everything going on. Luckily, we've been able to avoid that for the most part this year. Um, as I said, we're going to set a new record. It's going to be big, well over 2 billion gallons, and that's exactly what the industry needed this year. It's been a badly needed source of demand growth and really helped keep a floor under margins for this year. So overall, a great story for ethanol in 2025. We're continuing to see growth in shipments to Canada and the United Kingdom and the European Union, but also places like Colombia, Peru, the Philippines. We're seeing broad-based growth around the world when it comes to U.S. ethanol exports, and that has been a great news story for us this year. It provided a big lift for the industry, and we need to see that continue as we move into 2026.
And we've seen the Trump administration being on the side of ethanol and exports in these trade deals and in some of the actions the USTR is looking at against Brazil and China, right?
That's exactly right. I think the Trump administration has recognized and recognized very, very early on that ethanol is a product that is ready made for export, and it's every gallon of ethanol that we're exporting is not only supporting the biofuels industry, but it's supporting the ag industry and creating new demand for farmers. I mean, you think about the 2.1 billion gallons that we're exporting this year, that's roughly 700 million bushels of corn, if you think about it in that way. Uh, so they have been, I think, very smart about ensuring that biofuels and ethanol specifically are front and center in all of these discussions they're having around new trade deals and removing barriers and taking down tariffs and opening the market. Ethanol has been a key part of those discussions really in every market where the Trump negotiation has been negotiating on new trade deals. And so we're very appreciative of that. The most recent example is the investigation, the Section 301 investigation that USTR is conducting on China's unfair practices and its failure to meet its commitments under the 2020 and 2021 Phase 1 trade agreement, where China committed to dramatically increase its purchases of U.S. ag products. They didn't do that. Ethanol was meant to be part of those products that China would import. They didn't do that, and so now the Trump administration is looking into what action it should be considering to level the playing field and repair the damage done by China via its failure to meet its previous commitments. So, that's just like I said, the most recent example of this administration's focus on biofuel exports and ethanol specifically, and we've been very pleased to see that.
Well, the second press release that RFA released in 2025 was about the notice of intent from the Treasury Department to propose regulations for the clean fuel production credit 45Z. And also, right after that, we had the USDA's interim rule for climate smart agriculture. So, what has happened with 45Z and climate smart agriculture and a lot of the trappings of the Inflation Reduction Act
Sure.
since the Trump administration has taken over in 2025?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, what we saw from the Treasury and USDA and DOE in January of 2025 on 45Z, that's really the last thing we've seen from those agencies. So we are still awaiting more concrete guidance and regulations around 45Z. Of course, 45Z became the law of the land on January 1st of this year, and we got that initial guidance from the Treasury and some related pieces from USDA and the GREET model from DOE. And that all came out about a week or so before President Trump's inauguration. And like I said, we haven't heard much since from those agencies with regard to implementation of the tax credit. Uh, as you know, 45Z underwent a number of important changes in the one big beautiful bill that Congress passed this past summer. I think it was signed into law sometime right around July 4th by President Trump. And that legislation extended the 45Z credit by 2 years through 2029. It removed the indirect land use change penalty from the carbon intensity scoring framework, which was great news for our industry. It also restricted the eligibility for that tax credit to fuels that are made from feedstocks grown in North America. So in other words, the U.S. taxpayer won't be subsidizing the importation of used cooking oil from China and tallow from Brazil to make biofuels that generate or are eligible to generate the 45Z credit. So I think, what we saw out of the big beautiful bill was mostly good news for the industry with regard to 45Z. There were also some other provisions in that bill that were very important to the industry. Immediate expensing of research and development and research and experimentation expenses, things like that. So that package was really supportive of what we're trying to do in the ethanol industry, and it was a good piece of legislation for ethanol producers. But on 45Z, I mean, the problem that we continue to face today is we still don't have actual regulations from the IRS. We're still operating on that initial guidance or that notice of intent to propose regulations that was issued all the way back in January at the end of the Biden administration. And now, we're at the end of the year. It's time to file taxes for 2025. And there are still a lot of questions hanging out there about how exactly to claim this credit and exactly what that's going to look like. Now, we are expecting the IRS will be answering some of those questions very soon, at least with respect to the 2025 tax year. But we're still waiting on the formal proposed regulations that will really provide the guidance we're looking for long term on this program. And Treasury said don't expect to see those until May. We're hearing they might come sooner than that. We're hopeful they will come sooner than that. But, that's still going to be a proposal. It's still going to need to be finalized. It's going to go through the public comment process. So we're still months away from having final regulations for 45Z. and that means we're going to be continuing to deal with some uncertainty and some gray areas with respect to that tax credit, even though the law says taxpayers who are eligible can begin claiming that credit this year. So it has been one of those frustrating issues for the industry this year. And then on climate smart agriculture, you mentioned USDA put out a work product again all the way back in January. But climate smart ag is still not part of the 45Z program. And I think it's really important for people to understand that. So I'll say it again. 45Z is not part of the, I'm sorry, CSA is not part of the 45Z program. Ethanol producers have no way currently to lower their carbon intensity values or increase their 45Z credit values by purchasing CSA feedstock. And I think there's some misunderstanding about that in the marketplace. We're hearing of cases where farmers are asking ethanol plants to pay premiums for things like no-till and cover crops. And unfortunately, the ethanol producer has no way to recoup that premium. There's no value for those practices under 45Z. Uh, Now, could that change? Yes, it could. Treasury could decide to add CSA to the program sometime in 2026 as part of this rulemaking process we're talking about. And they could take the work that USDA has already done. They could fold that into the 45Z program. But we don't know sitting here today if that's something Treasury's going to do. And we won't know until they propose their rule. Uh, and as I said, I think under any case, we won't have a final rule until summer or fall of 2026, which means farmers will be thinking about harvest or maybe in the middle of harvest by that time. And so ethanol producers probably can't rely on CSA practices for 45Z values in 2026 either. We'll just have to wait and see and hope that Treasury can pick up the pace on getting this rulemaking done sooner than later. So it's going to be a big issue for us in 2026. I think you're going to see a lot of activity and a lot of action on 45Z as this proposal from Treasury finally hits the street.
Well, speaking of things that aren't getting done on time, RVOs and the SRE allocation, having that the small refinery exemptions reallocated. This was proposed back in what, April, May, June. What is the status of that right now? Tell us what they did propose and where we're at with that right now.
Yeah, so it was the early part of the summer. EPA did propose the highest ever renewable volume obligations under the RFS for 2026 and 2027. And that was, obviously great news for the industry. And we were very happy to see those. But those RVOs haven't been finalized yet. And again, we're probably not going to see a final rule until maybe February or March of 2026. And whether those RVOs end up being the best ever RFS volumes for us really all depends on what EPA does with small refinery exemptions. And as you know, the agency had a big backlog of old SRE petitions to deal with in 2025. There were somewhere around 200 petitions that were sitting there from years going all the way back to 2016. And EPA ended up approving most of those petitions and granting those exemptions, even if many of those were partial exemptions. But what they did that was very important here is for those old SRE petitions for 2016 through 2022, they returned expired RIN credits to those refiners. And that was exactly what we were hoping EPA would do because that means those exemptions, even though there were a bunch of them, will have no practical impact on biofuel demand moving forward because, again, EPA gave back expired RINs. Those credits have no currency. They can't be used for compliance with current standards. So that was good news and again, the right approach from EPA. But for those 2023 through 2025 petitions, and again, EPA approved a bunch of those, they returned RIN credits that do still have life. and still have validity. And those RINs can be used to demonstrate compliance. And so currently there's about 2 billion RINs sitting out there that EPA has given back to these refineries that can be used to meet their 2024 and 2025 standards. Uh, and frankly, there's probably going to be more RINs added when EPA decides those pending 2025 petitions. So, really where all this boils down is we're going to have to see what EPA is going to do about reallocation of those volumes, those exempted volumes for 2023 through 2025. If they fully reallocate those volumes and add them onto the 26 and 27 RVOs, then I think our industry would probably say, no harm, no foul. Uh, there's really no net loss in demand if that's the approach EPA takes. But if they only reallocate half, which is one of the approaches they proposed, or if they don't reallocate any of that volume, then the RVOs are effectively being reduced by 2 billion gallons or more in 2026 and 2027. And EPA could no longer argue that these are the highest and best RVOs ever adopted because, they'd be putting a 2 billion gallon hole in those RVOs by not reallocating these exemptions. So, again, expecting some big decisions, some very important decisions on the RFS coming early in the year. We've got February and March circled with a red marker on our calendar, and we'll be watching very closely to see what EPA does here.
Well, most of what we've been talking about so far has been from the administration, from the executive branch. But let's take a look at what the legislative and the judicial branches of government have done regarding ethanol this year. I know we had a Supreme Court ruling this year regarding um, proper venue for small refinery exemption cases, and the legislative branch, at least for several months now, has not seemed to get much done at all. Besides the big beautiful bill that we did see earlier in the year. So talk a little bit about the Supreme Court rulings and what has gotten or not gotten done in the legislative branch this year.
Yeah, the short answer is not much, Cindy. I mean, there really wasn't much happening legislatively that was important to the ethanol industry. We did see the year-round E15 legislation introduced early in the year. Of course, that's our top legislative priority. Here we are at the end of the year, and that legislation hasn't moved. We've seen various other, I guess, messaging bills introduced that would be favorable for biofuels if they were to pass, but we see really very very little opportunity that many of those bills are going anywhere. Certainly this year and probably next. But in terms of legislative activity in 2025, the big story, and we've already covered it, was the big beautiful bill and what it did to reform tax policy for not just the ethanol industry, but more broadly. That was the big story in Congress this year. Aside from that, not much, very little to talk about. You did mention a Supreme Court decision that came out earlier this year that was very favorable for us. RFA had appealed a ruling from the Fifth Circuit Court, and that appeal ended up in the Supreme Court this year. And really, what had happened is the Fifth Circuit had overturned several SRE petitions that EPA had denied, and the Fifth Circuit, in its infinite wisdom, said EPA should have granted those petitions. And we said, well, hold on, wait a minute. The Fifth Circuit, which represents Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, really has no business even hearing cases about small refinery exemption petitions or the RFS at all. The RFS is a national program, it's national in scope. The Clean Air Act is very clear that cases involving clean air programs, including the RFS, that are national in scope can only be heard in the DC Circuit Court. That is the only proper venue for those challenges. And so the Fifth Circuit or the Eighth Circuit or the Fourth Circuit or any of these other regional circuit courts are not the appropriate venue, and they really don't have any authority to entertain these challenges. That was our argument to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed with us on that and found in our favor. And so moving forward, uh, we believe, and EPA has already shown signs that they are following the Supreme Court's decision. Any challenges to SRE decisions should only be heard in the DC Circuit Court, and we think that that's very helpful in that it removes the potential for a big patchwork of different decisions in different regions of the country on SRE petitions.
Well, we know it has been a big year for production of both corn and ethanol. And at this point, how does it look right now?
Yeah, it was a big year, a really big year. Obviously, the largest ever corn crop in 2025. We saw a record by far. USDA says farmers harvested a record crop of 16.8 billion bushels. That's almost 2 billion bushels larger than the 2024 crop and about a billion and a half bushels larger than the previous record crop. So, you know, we got plenty of corn. And I think that is as much a curse as it is a blessing for farmers. This productivity is astounding. It's something that farmers should be proud of. It's something our country should be proud of. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword for farmers. We have to make sure that demand is keeping up with supply. Otherwise, we're going to see corn stocks rise to untenable levels. We're going to have big piles of corn sitting around with no place to go. Corn prices fall to levels where farmers aren't profitable. And, unfortunately, we're seeing that play out now. We saw that happen this year. Uh, for our part, I'd say, the ethanol industry is doing everything we can to help with that situation. We're doing our part to help grow corn demand and would be doing so much more if the government would let us. If we could get year-round E15, if we could get some of these other barriers out of the way, we could grind a whole lot more corn into ethanol than we are currently doing today. But we are going to end up with record ethanol production in 2025. We're estimating somewhere around 16.4 billion gallons of ethanol production. That would be an all-time record, up about 200 million gallons or so from last year's record. So, as I said, we're doing what we can to keep the pedal down on corn grind. We think when the final numbers come in, you're going to see, somewhere around 5.6, 5.7 billion bushels of corn were used for ethanol in 2025. And that would put ethanol right up there neck and neck with livestock feed as the top user or the top demand segment for U.S. corn growers. And like I said, if we had year-round E15 nationwide, we could easily be doing 6 billion bushels or 6.5 billion bushels of corn use in the ethanol industry in a few years if we could just get that barrier out of the way.
It's amazing. That's a lot of records. And I don't know if we would have envisioned that 20 years ago. It was the 20th anniversary of the RFS this year. How would you rate this year overall for ethanol?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. It was the 20th anniversary for the RFS in 2025. It gave us a great opportunity to really look back and celebrate the successes of the RFS over the past two decades, and really reflect on how the industry has changed and how we've grown over those 20 years. It is remarkable when you sit back and think about where we were as an industry in 2005 and how far we've come in the last 20 years. And a big part of that, a big reason for our progress is the renewable fuel standard. It's done everything it was intended to do. It's boosted domestic energy production. It's reduced oil imports. It's lowered prices at the pump for consumers. It's reduced emissions from the transportation sector. And as we've talked about, it's created new market opportunities for farmers. So that's what it was supposed to do. That's what the program has done. And I think all of those reasons for creating the RFS in the first place are as important today as they were 20 years ago. And so the RFS is still the bedrock policy for the ethanol industry, and really provides that important backstop for us. And, I think all in all, 2025 was a great year for the industry. We saw additional growth, as I've talked about. We saw record production. record exports, solid profitability for the industry. But we continue to face some frustrations. And again, we think there's so much more that the industry could be doing if we were let off the leash to do so. And if we got some of these barriers and regulations out of the way that are holding us back as an industry. Um, so, I think as we finish out the year, Cindy, we continue to have lots of unanswered questions about the RVOs, about SREs, about year-round E15, 45Z. These are all issues that really need to be resolved as early as possible in 2026. And if they're resolved favorably and the outcomes are positive for the industry, we think 2026 could be a watershed year for the industry and for the farmers that support us. So we're very excited about what the new year brings, and again, grateful for the accomplishments and success we saw in 2025.
And you said that if ethanol could just get off the leash. What a
Yeah.
great lead in to the NEC coming up February 24th through the 26th in Orlando, Florida. Ethanol Unleashed. Give
Yep.
us a quick preview.
The theme of our conference, Ethanol Unleashed, is exactly focused on the things that we've been talking about. If ethanol was truly unleashed, unshackled, what could we do as an industry to further reduce energy imports and further reduce consumer energy prices and further reduce emissions in the atmosphere? There's so much more our industry could be doing with just some very simple, common sense, straightforward policy and regulatory solutions. And so that's going to be the focus of our conference in 2026, and really painting the picture of what the world could look like if those barriers were removed and ethanol was allowed to compete on its merits in the marketplace. And we think the benefits of that sort of scenario would be tremendous, not just for consumers and farmers here in the U.S., but frankly around the world.
And we just saw the preliminary agenda for the conference has been released, and discount pricing for registration is still available. And all you have to do is go to nationalethanolconference.com, right?
That's right. Yep, we are expecting even better attendance at the 2026 NEC than we had last year, and last year was the highest we'd seen in 6 or 7 years. So things are off to a great start. We have a fantastic program that's being pulled together. Really high profile, top notch speakers and panels looking at the future of our industry and some of the current barriers and challenges we're facing and strategizing on how to navigate those. So we're very excited about seeing everyone in Orlando for the 2026 NEC.
Alrighty then, we hope to see everyone there at the NEC in February in Orlando. Thanks, Geoff, and Happy New Year to everyone from the RFA and the Ethanol Report.